Hey guys, how's it going? Kripp'S here. Today I give you guys my thoughts on Diablo 4 Season 2. Honestly, I didn't think I would be making this video before Season 2 had come out. They did have some pretty ambitious changes. We had the patch notes like almost a week before the season launched, and it certainly looked like things could take a turn for the better, but it's really hard to really believe it, at least from my side, until I got my hands on the game. And now that I've played about a week straight of Diablo 4, I would say that I am really surprised on how well things have turned out for the game. And I also have seen a lot of my fellow content creators make videos about their opinions, about their gameplay experience, and I actually don't agree with a lot of them, so I thought I would voice my opinion just so you guys can at least have a different one. So Season of Blood came out about a week ago, and Season of Blood introduced this mechanic where there are these zone takeovers by the vampires, and you go and beat them up and get some kind of powers and loot and EXP. And it sounds like a pretty simple mechanic, but I actually think the mechanic for Season 2 is nearly perfect. And I'll go into why. So a lot of my opinions come from my time playing Path of Exile. In Path of Exile, new league comes out, league or a season as you may, or expansion sometimes they call them. It's kind of a big change to the game, new character ladder in a way, and I basically play for like a week, sometimes 2 weeks, a bit off stream. Sometimes it keeps my attention for a month. Path of Exile is a pretty intricate game. Now, Diablo this time around actually delivered on what I really enjoy from new PoE leagues, and again, I was pretty surprised by this because I didn't expect to have such a good time. So what changed? How was my journey? So through the changes, there's so many changes, and I'll go over all the different ones. I ended up rolling with a Shadow Golemancer. It was difficult to really understand what they had really changed from the patch notes. It was really hard to get a grasp for the sum of the patch notes because it's like, hey, we're going to redo the overpower mechanic, but it actually took people months when the game came out to figure out how overpower works. So even though it's like, maybe it will be good, it was really hard to really say just by looking at the patch notes. So I went with a pretty safe pick, but it was a class that I really liked, a golem-based necromancer. They doubled the golem damage. They made certain minion aspects work for golems, and they were really powerful ones too. So it was without question that the golem is going to be like at least 5 times stronger, and it was. But there were a few other bugs, and the minion AI honestly felt a little bit worse this league. Nevertheless, I got into the game, I got into the season, and the first thing I did is I jumped into the new zones, the new vampire zones, and while I don't think they were quite like the best experience to level up at the start, it was like 80% of just the experience you'd get farming the best dungeon, which is what some of the hardcore level racers were doing. So it was a very comparable experience. As you guys may know from playing Diablo this season, the loot dropping from the chests and the monsters and the combination of doing so while also completing the Whispers quests, it was actually the best volume of loot in the game. So 10 out of 10 loot, 8 out of 10 experience gain, and by playing through these you would unlock the vampire powers, and the vampire powers are actually hugely character defining. They actually seemed to work as stated. They were pretty clear. They added very unique ways to play characters by changing your dodge, by adding things like vulnerable that some builds really couldn't access. It felt like they went through the major class and system problems with characters, designing characters in Diablo 4, and just added powers to fix everything. They also did not say, like they did in Season 1, that they would be scrapping this mechanic on the next season. So if we continue to have at least some versions of these vampire powers for future characters, it actually would complement the game greatly, and I hope they do, well, exactly that. So I would actually actually rate this mechanic a 9.5 out of 10. The 0.5 is lost from the really horrible experience of actually leveling up the powers. It's such a bad system that it is mind-blowing that it went through. But once you go through that painful process, you don't have to touch it again, and you can enjoy the rest of what the league mechanic has. It's a league mechanic that you engage with immediately when you log in. It's a league mechanic that is worth doing. It's a league mechanic that changes the fundamental design of your characters. It's a league mechanic that is constantly engaging and bringing you back because you can stack it with the other mechanics that push farming and experience gain, like Trio Whispers, like actually doing some quests while you're doing the vampire zones. And it added a little bit of difficulty because if you're in the vampire zone for a while, you get the blood seekers after you that have pretty good loot drops, but they're actually pretty hard. And sometimes when you're in Nightmare Dungeon, these guys actually appear out of nowhere, and sometimes it's a boss. You get like a random boss beating on you in a dungeon. And this mechanic is really cool, and these guys, especially in the Nightmare Sigils, are some of the hardest monsters in any Nightmare Dungeons. They have like 10 times the health. So there is like this butcher-like experience when you're playing Nightmare Dungeons. Really a fantastic thing. It is a very difficult thing to hit on all those notes. Even Path of Exile struggles with this in some leagues where it can be difficult to have a balanced, worthwhile, and a mechanic you constantly engage with at all levels. That's like the trifecta that I feel like PoE tries to hit on every single season, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Well, Diablo 4 just hit on it on Season 2. And coming off of Season 1 and pre-season with all the disappointments and bugs and balance issues and lack of things to do after 100, this is really quite a turn of events in my opinion, and brings me to a state where I'm actually pretty optimistic about future seasons in Diablo 4. And again, coming at the end of Season 1, I didn't exactly feel that way. So that was pretty cool. They also mentioned that it'll take like 40% less experience to level to 100. It's hard to really know what that means because there's so many changes. The characters are different. You have the powers. You're often engaging with the vampire zone, which is pretty powerful. You're able to do other things more efficiently. The higher character power means that you can do Nightmare Sigils. Like on my Sork, second character, by the way, I was just leveling in Nightmare Dungeons like 75 just because, you know, they were just as fast as doing like Nightmare Dungeon 40. So, in reality, it took me about 25 hours to level my first Necromancer to 100, and I would say probably 20 or so, plus minus 10%, to level my second character, my Firewall Sork, to level 100. So overall, that was pretty cool. A lot of people, a lot of other streamers said that there isn't enough content there, but I really feel like the content unlocks for the hardcore players of Diablo making new characters. Now, what they've done in Diablo 4 this season, they've actually made it really enjoyable to make and play a new character. And part of that is, well, the new bosses. They have these bosses that you kind of get the pieces all over the map. It's not a fleshed out system. I think they could definitely do better with it, but coming from absolutely nothing to this system with pieces from different mechanics that bring together, and you can actually have somewhat engaging content. We'll get to that in a second. And you can get very meaningful loot off of them. They have this new system where you need to face like level 100 monsters to even have a chance at the highest item levels. And then you can go to even higher level monsters than that, or bosses, which have kind of like a plus invisible level line, so you can access some of the really powerful loot. The bosses are just dropping really powerful loot pretty regularly. They're dropping forcefully some targeted uniques. And this whole system, again, it's not perfect, but it's so much better than what they had in pre-season and Season 1. And if you engage with the system, what happened to me and what happened to a lot of other players is you use your boss materials to fight the bosses. You fight Dur, you fight those guys, and you get a few pieces of gear that don't quite work for the character that you're playing. But then you can use your imagination or go onto like a build site like Mobalytics, you know, shameless plug, to find a build that does work with those items, or at least can work with those items. And that was really inspiring for me to make my second character. So I made a second character, and I kind of went through that process again, and it didn't feel like a chore. I had a lot of fun with it. This whole new thing with items capping out around 925, but you need to face level 100 monsters to unlock that cap, and anything beyond that increases the rate at which you get them. It creates a situation where you have a meaningful choice how you level up your character. Let me explain. Now, if all you do is get the optimal experience to get to level 100, you're going to have a character that doesn't really have fully leveled up glyphs. You're going to have a character that might not even have all the vampire powers. You might not have very good gear. You might not have the uniques that you want. And you might have gear that's fairly low item level. So a few things that I did, but you don't have to do it this way. I figured that I can engage with the league mechanic from the very first few levels, so I did. So I leveled constantly in the vampire zones up until about level 50 or 60, and then I started doing nightmare sigils. But on the refresh each hour, I would go back to the vampire zone just to be in there a while to complete the Whispers quest, because the Whispers quests start giving you some of those boss materials even in the mid levels, which is pretty cool. As I approached like 70s and 80s, I'm starting to do nightmare sigils because I want to level up my glyphs. But famously, some players who got like first 100 on this season start, they didn't even have all their main glyphs to 15. So right now, you can choose. Do I want to actually have a character that has most of the power unlocked through the glyphs by doing nightmare sigils? Do I want a character that has its power unlocked through powerful uniques and legendary aspects by going through the loot zone, the vampire zone? Do I want to target very specific slots for very specific stats? Do I need to farm Hell Tides more to get like Forgotten Souls and whatnot? And another thing is these level breakpoints kind of change how you're doing things. So for example, when I was level 90, even though I kind of needed to do Helltide, if I do Helltide is my level plus 3, so I can't actually get level 925. But at level 90, I'm easily strong enough to do Nightmare Sigils over level 50, which can drop 925s. So at 90, I stopped doing Helltides completely just because I wanted that glyph experience and I wanted that option to unlock the highest item level gear. And then once I was 100, I started doing Helltides again. So really meaningful decisions, real choice on how you want to level based on which part of your character that you want to maximize. I haven't really heard anyone talk about this, but they really actually landed in a pretty good spot when it comes to this. Now, let's quickly talk about some of those mechanics. So, the bosses, we have some issues with the bosses. The bosses, they're generally easy, as people call it, but I think the problem is more fundamental than that. A game like Path of Exile, and honestly a game like Diablo 2, which people regard as having fantastic, like, you know, character power and item strength and all that, these like pretty legendary pillars of ARPG and its history, it's usually constrained on something, okay? Both Diablo 2 and Path of Exile are often constrained on your defenses. It's very hard to increase the defenses of your character meaningfully. It's very difficult to not get one-shotted, so you kind of have to always keep that in mind. And in Diablo 4, you can have an item that has ridiculous defensive properties. You can have a chest piece, and each stat on your chest piece can reduce the damage that you take by about 20, which is crazy. Diablo 4 is actually kind of limiting you on your damage, which is interesting. It is interesting. There is no piece of gear that has 4 stats that each stat gives you 20% more damage, for example. There's not. Okay? But things get a little bit weird. When you go to like legendary aspects, the offensive aspects are still like 30% damage, but the defensive aspects are still like 30% damage reduction. So when it comes to the aspects, they're even. That's really weird in my opinion. But this really only works with pigeonholing like your damage, putting kind of a ceiling on it. They're definitely trying to do that. But it only works if they have fine-tuned balance. Well, they don't. A few builds slipped through the cracks. There's maybe 5, but probably in the next few days or weeks, probably 10, maybe 20, that have some really powerful synergies and combinations. There's barbarian builds that literally kill 4-player Duriel, which is by far the highest health minion in the game, or boss in the game, in one attack. It's like a 500 million damage. Bonk, dead, right? So these combinations exist, but it's not like one build. It's not like one build fell through the cracks and they got to nerf it. No, it's like 10 builds, maybe 15 builds, maybe it'll be 20 builds. Other than those, most builds, damage-wise, are pretty well balanced. If none of the builds slipped through the cracks, I actually think they would have fairly meaningful boss encounters this season, but that was pretty far from the case. So they still have to work on that. It's just, I feel like they're really shooting themselves in the foot, because I think it's a lot harder to balance around damage than it is to balance around defense. So that is a bit of a tricky one. Part of farming for the boss materials includes having to do a wide variety of things, and one of those things is Helltide. With the new zone mechanic, the vampire zones, being pretty similar to Helltide, it offers a stark comparison of, hey, wait, it actually is way more fun to do the vampire zones than it is to do Helltide. And a lot of people really hate Helltide now because they have to do it if they want to farm the bosses. And yes, I agree, but I think the change is pretty subtle. My main issue with Helltide is a lot of the zones, you don't get to like choose the mobs. They're not very good mobs, and they often have like delayed drops. It's just super annoying to have to kill something, wait for it to die, the thing drops on the ground, and then you have to walk over to get it. I think the simplest, most elegant, and best way to fix Helltides is the splinters. Wherever it drops, if you killed it or if an ally killed it like a screen away, it just goes to your character. You don't have to actually walk over any of the splinters, the Helltide cinders or whatever it's called. I think that single change is going to make people actually quite enjoy Helltide. But I think for the long term, they maybe can look at a few other options. So that's a pretty big one. But honestly, other than that, the overall gameplay loop is pretty good, but it once again reinforces the fact that Diablo 4 needs a solo self-found mode. A lot of people just want to play not exactly by themselves, just along other players by themselves. Diablo 4 does a fantastic job of this mechanic. You can experience it in the new Vampire Zones, or you can experience it in, Helltide, for example, or a few other mechanics. But when it comes to dungeon content, you have to group with other players if you want to play with them. When it comes to doing a boss like Duriel, only one player needs to put the materials in to effectively summon Duriel, but each of the 4 players are going to get their individualized loot from Duriel. Basically meaning they get 4 times as much loot if they do it in a full party. This system is fine. Some people like it. Some people just want to play with their friends. Some people don't even play with 4. They play with 3. They play with 2. Their friend group. I think that's cool. I don't think Blizzard should mess with that, but I do think that players that want to play by themselves, Blizzard should acknowledge their option to do so, and they can kind of feel more accomplished within that realm, the players that is, if they have an SSF mode, solo self-found mode. And it doesn't seem crazy to ask for one, because a few months ago, they actually implemented solo self-found mode in Diablo 3. So I really don't think it's a lot to ask for. Just don't allow players to group with other people, and don't allow trade with other players. Whenever there's kind of like an issue with like duplicating or whatever, they had maybe a couple, not too many, they've just disabled trading until they get it fixed. So they can just disable trading whenever they want. And I think it's cool to play along other players, like if you find them in Helltides or whatnot, or in world bosses. But if you just disable the ability to group, it's much more meaningful, and players who are a bit more hardcore, like the players who want to get more out of the game, well, they can just play by themselves because it'll take longer to kill the same amount of Duriels in solo self-found mode. So that's a pretty big one. And lastly, I want to mention, it was actually brought up by Zizaran in our D4 podcast. If you guys want to check that out, it's on the second channel. I'll give you guys a link for that below. I actually leveled up to 100 on my Sorc during the podcast, so you get some gameplay with that as well if you want to see that build happening. He mentioned that Diablo 4 really needs a Vol Orb system. Where is it? There we go, that one. So for those that haven't played Path of Exile, a Vol Orb is an item that it can add a stat to an item that is kind of like a unique stat and it's an extra stat, or it can mess up the item completely, or it can delete the item. Okay, those are the rough options of a Vol Orb. The idea is when you use a Vol Orb, you can no longer ever modify the item in any way. And when it comes to Diablo 4, you wouldn't be able to blacksmith upgrade. Maybe you can't even like change the gem in the item. Maybe you can't change a stat in the item. But the idea being that Diablo 4, you actually get hit with a lot of loot that's pretty good. Like, I don't know, for example, the chest piece on my Sork, it's the best chest piece that I've found, but I have like 10 other chest pieces that are 90% as good. If I had this like YOLO currency to potentially make them quite a bit better or destroy them, I'd have a lot more fun with my character. Overall, I played Season 2 for about a week straight. I think it is not a perfect game, but the difference in Season 2 versus preseason and Season 1, I think is actually pretty remarkable. I was quite blown away by just how fun it was to play, how easy it was to just pick up a new character, play through it, and just have an enjoyable gaming experience. Diablo 4 always had a strength, and it was just kind of fun to play characters. They just fixed a lot of the other stuff in Season 2, and honestly, I think they did a pretty good job at it. I don't think Diablo 4 is going to be competing with Path of Exile for like people hardcore to play the game a month at a time, but I think especially if you consider making like a second character or maybe a third character, even the hardcore players can get a week, maybe 2 out of each season. And honestly, I think that's great. I don't have that many complaints about the game right now, so let me know if you agree or whatever, and I hope you guys enjoyed my talk.